This is Thank You Mama, weekly lessons from mothers all around the world. Hi and welcome to the new episode of Thank You Mama. I'm very excited to introduce to you my new guest, Roxanne Derhodge. Roxanne is originally from Trinidad but lives in Canada. And Roxanne is a psychotherapist and consultant, and she works with a topic which is very relevant to us right now, which is resilience. Roxanne, will you tell us more about your work?
Absolutely. I started quite early into the field. At 21, I started as a psychotherapist with the Metro Toronto Police and have spent a span kind of taking on different roles. I worked in addictions. I worked with trauma. I also worked with health and wellness strategy as a consultant, and then eventually started my own business where I do consulting with companies and talk to them on their strategy in reference to authenticity and mental resilience within their leaders and their C-suite and their teams. Along with, keynote speaking, I also do a podcast, which is called Authentic Living with Roxanne.
Roxanne, reading about you and your childhood, I'm sorry I haven't read your book yet. Your book title is?
It's A Therapist Insider's Guide on Relationships.
And you guide us through therapy by doing therapy on yourself in your book.
Absolutely. And it was one of those things that at the time that I was deciding how to pivot after getting a corporate package, I thought, well, what could I share? What did I learn? Whether it was frontline working with someone in trauma to dealing with CEOs at a C-suite or a board, the one commonality was that we all bring ourselves to relationships. So what I thought was, why not kind of share? The average person is kind of oftentimes, I think, remiss in speaking to someone like myself. So I thought I would flip, quote unquote, the therapy lens onto my own life. And I did that intentionally because I wanted to show people that we all bring lots of things with us in our life to relationships. And sometimes some of those things are phenomenal, but unfortunately at times we replicate patterns that may not kind of bode us the outcome that we're looking for. So that's what I did. I analyzed myself from birth all the way up to age 45, at which point I had gone through substantive change. I'd gone through a separation along with getting a corporate severance after being in consulting for 16 years. I stopped and then decided, why not share what I know about myself and what I do to help others that are sometimes trying to figure out the awareness within themselves and relationship, not just to themselves, but to others in their lives.
Roxanne, and you're also a mother of one.
He's an 18, almost 19-year-old boy, and the love of my life. He's a phenomenal young man, and he's just started university, and I'm doing the empty nesting bit, which is, I wish I could say I'm doing very well with it, but it's been quite a reflective time kind of looking at this particular stage of my life just recently.
I was listening together with my 5-year-old, with Kai, yesterday. I was listening to the podcast you and I did, where I was guesting on your podcast, and you introduced me and we talk about Kai, and I said the same thing you did. I say how amazing he is, and you should have seen the smile on his face. He was so happy to hear that.
I could just imagine.
But talking about motherhood and mothers, let's introduce your mother.
So my mom, her name is Carol, and she had 6 children by the time she was 28 years old. So she met my father quite young, I think around age 17. And she grew up in a very big extended family as well. She was a family of 11, and she was the youngest girl to her family. Her family kind of came from a pretty privileged kind of business family, and she met my dad, and he came from more of an impoverished kind of situation, and she fell madly in love with him, and they had their first child when she was 18. I think in retrospect, when I think of my mom, she was looking to find the love that she didn't, I think, receive or perceive herself as receiving as a young girl. And I think meeting my dad that young, she kind of wanted to start and repair or create those connections that she had missed when she was a young child.
And this is all in Trinidad?
Absolutely. So my history, the Caribbean islands, whether you know much history or your listeners do, a lot of people moved. Obviously, there was slavery in the islands, but with my history, my ancestry came from from mostly India, and we're thinking potentially in the Middle East on my mother's side. And so people came in, they were given property to be able to farm the land and work on the land, and they were given property. So a lot of people kind of came over from India and the Middle East way back in the 1800s.
And what did your parents do?
Well, she was a stay-at-home mom. I think, she had 6 children. So she stayed at home and she did everything related to our upbringing, speaking to the element of mothers or the emotional kind of glue to a family. Definitely that was her role. She took care of everything. My father was a pretty busy executive, and really at times his times were limited, and he traveled a lot and those types of things. So she took care of everything related to caring for us emotionally and physically. And she was often the one that attended all of our activities and never missed one of the activities that any 6 of us were involved with at any given point.
That's amazing. I also read about how wealthy relatives of yours offered to adopt you who lived in Canada, and your mama just would not let you go.
Absolutely. And I think, I think back to that, and I remember that time, and I was about 11 years old. So my dad's uncle lived in Dallas, Texas, and he would visit the island, obviously, lots. And I was just, for some reason, one of his favorites. And I remember them, for some reason, having conversations. But now as an 11-year-old, you're thinking, wow, I get to go away. I'm not thinking of the whole impact of that. And I remember my parents blatantly saying, absolutely not, because there's no way that they could have lived with anyone of their children, even though at that time I'm thinking it's a bit of an adventure. It is, as an 11-year-old. In retrospect, I would have been devastated had that occurred, and I don't believe my parents would have let it happen anyway.
I love that. When did you then move to Canada?
So I moved to Canada when I was 16 years old to go to university. So I was kind of, they call us the brats of the 70s from the Caribbean. So with the oil boom in Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad was quite a economically privileged island. And so most of us kind of left the island to pursue postgraduate degrees throughout Europe, the States and Canada. And I left at 16 and then came up here and attended the University of Toronto.
How did your mama deal with it when you guys started leaving to universities?
Well, I could tell a story of when my dad talked about, and I kind of reminisce to this about my son leaving. So the flight from Trinidad to Toronto is about 5.5 to 6 hours. So the first daughter that they dropped off, which was my oldest sister, she was going to private school to finish grade 13. My mom apparently cried the entire flight back, not uncontrollably. And my dad was trying to console her, but she cried and cried and cried, because I said to her, I am now a mom to, an 18-year-old, and I'm starting to think of each time you let one of your children go. She said it was an immense amount of grief with each child that left the island. And she said it never got easier. She just accepted it on a different level.
Oh, that makes me so sad. That breaks my mama heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hadn't thought about it until I was going through the same kinds of things, where I think now, my son was 18 and I was thinking, oh my goodness, he's way too young. And I was 16. My sister was also 16. And most of us left around 16 or 17 years old. So I could imagine, I did it once and it was tough on me. So doing it with 6 children. And my father felt the same. But of course, he said he kind of had to keep it together to be able to support my mother, because obviously she was the one that, he would quite literally say, she gave you guys the foundation. I worked financially to support you guys, but she gave you everything else that, you've acquired today.
Did everybody leave, Roxanne, or did one of your brothers or sisters stay with her?
Everybody left, except there was one sister that got married, and she stayed on the island. But what happened is most of us stayed here. So I stayed in Canada, and so did several of my siblings. Some of them went back when they were kind of figuring out their path for adulthood. So she did have some of them go back, but okay. Most of us stayed in North America and kind of pursued our lives and our families there.
But tell me, now I'm curious, now that I know so much about her, what did you learn from her? Do you have any lessons you'd like to share with us?
Well, my mother, I often say, and she would help anyone. She was the type of mother that, there was a cousin that lived with my grandparents, and his parents had him out of wedlock, and my grandparents raised him. My mom took care of him like he was my brother. So technically, I feel like I ended up having, 6 siblings instead of 5. So she took in people because she cared so much. She taught me how to really care and be of service to others. So my cousin quite literally grew up as my brother. She treated him the same. He was given the same kind of privilege. And, so that unconditional element of if anybody was having a tough time in the family, when my grandmother on my father's side was ailing, my mother was the first go-to. She would make sure that my grandmother got taken care of. So that's one thing that I think I learned from my mother. My mother is a very, very caring person, and she was always of service. Where we had people come over and stay with us that were just having a hard time potentially in the family, she would kind of open the door and treat them as part of her family when people were having tough times.
That's beautiful. So you implement this.
I absolutely do. I kind of think of my whole element of, at 11, I thought I wanted to become a psychologist. And that obviously came from, I think, a lot of different places. But I think definitely with the influence of my mother and how self-sacrificing and self-giving she was, I think that was probably unconsciously or consciously part of the reason that I ended up in the helping field.
Anything else?
Definitely loving your children unconditionally. I think that was also something I learned. So I'm a, very unconditional, loving mother. And I think that's something that I saw that she gave to all 6 of us. And, an example that I would think of, Anna, is that every single year, each one of us had a birthday party. So not one person had the same different privilege from another. And she also made it all of them special events. So I think that unconditional love for her children was also something that I think I know definitely that in my family, and particularly with myself, that's something that I learned to do very well through looking at her loving her children.
Roxanne, I had a guest who also mentioned unconditional love for her children as a lesson she learned from her mom. But she also mentioned what I found very interesting as a parent. She said, my mom loved us unconditionally, but managed not to spoil us.
Well, I wish I could say that about my mother. I would say that my mother spoiled us in that I think what she did is she gave the lesson that I think she could have taught us better or demonstrated a role model better is self-love for herself. Because I think that's the lesson that I've learned now as a mom, right? In order to love unconditionally, you have to be able to be filled up to yourself. And I think, unfortunately, with my mom, because I don't think she'd had the support that she needed from my dad, she had to do it all on her own. So some of it, I believe, was circumstantial in that, in today's day and age, we can get support from partners to be able to take that time. But that was something that I think would have been a lesson that I think was a little bit lost. I didn't see her loving herself enough and nurturing herself in order to continue giving us love.
Isn't that a huge lesson for all moms? And the balance, I think self-love is such a question of balance as well. How much self-love is right and how much is too less and how much is too much? When does it become selfishness in a way?
That's a fine line, right? But I think an internal place that a lot of mothers struggle with, right? If you're a working mom, and which I went back when RJ was 1 year old. And I remember the feeling so pulled in so many directions because of my corporate responsibilities and my hours and my travel. Sometimes it became tough to really kind of implement that. And I think that had I seen that a little bit more, I think I probably would have been able to role model a little bit better for myself and some of the things that I should have done a little bit better within myself.
We talked about this with my experience with my mom on your podcast. What I've always found very inspiring is how she managed to give me this unconditional love, but also stay her own person with her own career and her own friends and her own life. And in a way, her own strong center. I don't know how else to put it, but to always be very centered in herself, which I thought was very inspiring, and which is helping me now with Kai, because when I had him, having remembered my experiences with being in nursery at the age of 1, like, and having this mom who was working and doing other things, I thought I want to be more dedicated to my son. But as he's growing older, I'm learning that it's fantastic that he's learning that mom has her life as well, and her career and her things to do. You know, I hope that that's the right thing to do.
And I think it definitely is. Like, I think of myself, I didn't have that role model in that way because your mom had a career. My mom, her career was taking care of her children. So, when I was juggling it, I was often kind of saying, am I doing it? Am I doing it enough of it? Am I giving him the time? Because I was, doing so much in my career. So at times I would kind of struggle with what's the right balance. And, I think that's something that from consulting with professional women or coaching, that a lot of professional women, they struggle with at times, and they have to kind of go internally to kind of figure out what feels best for them, knowing themselves and in turn their family kind of situation.
I'm a big believer in love. I really think if you really deeply, truly, unconditionally love your child, then every moment you spend with him is worth hundreds of times more than somebody who's not so directly honest. And you know what I mean? I think that it's not the amount of time we spend with them, but how we feel towards them and how they feel our love.
Absolutely. And I would say that's as a psychotherapist, I often say that my role in that role is reparative parenting. Because a lot of times adults come back and the emotional repair that they're needing is often done with a lack of needs that were unmet in childhood. Mm-hmm. And, the therapist in a way becomes like the surrogate parent that people reenact the needs that were not met as they were growing through their formative years. So I think you're right. The best we can do as human beings is to try to give that deep space within yourself to a child. It's about quality time versus, lots of time, because I think that really gives that child that unconditional space to be in your presence and feel the space of love that, really absorbs into them and really helps them define who they become as human beings.
Roxanne, but let's go back to Mama Carol.
Yes.
Do we have more lessons we'd like to share from Mama Carol?
Other things that I think she would have been, I think a lesson that I think would be in that caring and service was to also put boundaries in place. Because I think she was so much into giving, again, going back to that selfless kind of love, that learning to put boundaries when people were taking advantage of her would have been something that I think as a woman or as a person today, I didn't see that, because she really didn't show or react to people to let you know when they had wronged her. So she must have absorbed a lot of that. But now as an adult, as I can look at it as a different lens and think back to some of the things that happened, I think had she maybe verbalized or demonstrated that when someone had, breached her boundaries a little bit more, it may have been more of an open lesson for me to experience, and then in turn learn that lesson to be able to bring it forward in my own life.
Roxanne, how did you learn that? How did you for yourself then learn to put boundaries up?
In various ways. I think from seeing it around different relationships. I think formally training in my internship, what happens is we bring ourselves to the therapy room, and anything that were blockages that potentially occurred in our life could also create its space in the therapy room with the clients. So what would happen is if someone was breaching a boundary with me and I was not being aware, then my clinical supervisors, who oftentimes would view my work through a two-way mirror, and that's what would happen when you're interning. So you would see a patient, there would be a two-way mirror, and your clinical supervisors or your team would be behind the mirror. And then they would ask you kind of what's happening there. There seems to be this client is challenging you, but they're not doing it in a healthy way. How come you didn't say anything about that? So what happens is in vivo, you're learning in the moment, because then you question yourself and say, yeah, why didn't I respond in a different way? That was kind of disrespectful to maybe the partner or to the child in the room. As the therapist, how come you didn't intervene? So those were the actual kind of practical pieces that I started to learn relatively quickly as I pursued my craft.
Roxanne, this is fantastic. Thank you for teaching us that. We should all go through this just with somebody behind the mirror.
Absolutely. It's very, very powerful. Now, needless to say, as a young therapist, you feel kind of scrutinized, but it really allows you to recognize the things that you are replicating that in fact is not useful for helping the people that have come to you for help. So I think absolutely, our unconscious runs most of our lives oftentimes. And as a therapist, you have to recognize that you're absorbing or going into the space of what the client is bringing. And then you're also bringing your frame of reference or your family of origin with you. So it's quite the intricate balance between staying objective and not getting drawn into your experience of your life and what kind of beliefs or assumptions developed in your life, and how does that kind of mix with the client's beliefs and assumptions, and making sure that you're staying as neutral as possible while still being human and connected.
Wow, I seriously wish we could all learn that. We could all go through this training. No, it would. Can you imagine how amazing our relationships would be if we learned that?
Absolutely, it would be. It's very, very powerful because you can't hide, right? Because obviously they pose a question to you, and what they do is there's a telephone in the consulting room, and the client is aware, right? So you're an intern, so they're aware that you're being consulted with, and there's a team behind there, and they'll explicitly ask you, okay, I'd like you to change your posture. I'd like you to lower your voice. I'd like you to join with this person in a different way. I think you're, marginalizing this relationship in the room. And then you do it, and then the entire shift of the patient and their relationship with you shifts. So it is very powerful, and I think it would be great if that could be something that the average person could go through.
But, I will take this for myself. I will, next time I'm in a strange situation where I wish I had better boundaries, I'll just imagine I am watching myself behind the mirror and try to think of what I would want to say to myself. Try to see my reactions in a more objective way so that I can put up my boundaries.
And what you could do, an exercise you could do, is when something happens like that, you can, after you're out of the situation, you can go back and you could reflect on it and journal on it and try to use the lens of the observer and say, what happened there? What was I telling myself? What was I feeling and what was I experiencing? And where did that come from the interaction? And that will allow you to really kind of get into the space of what was happening in that situation. And then you could kind of learn from the event. It may be harder to do it in the situation, but the more that you practice it gets a little bit easier.
Thank you, Roxanne. We are learning something practical from you right now. Do we have more we'd like to learn from Mama Carol, or?
I think the one other thing I would have hoped that I would learn from her. So my parallel with my mother is that I separated at 45 when I wrote my book, and I walked away from a relationship that was not meeting my needs. With myself, when my parents separated, so my parents separated around when I was 22. My father finally left my mother. My mother did not walk away. So that I think also for myself, that may have been something that would have been valuable for me to see, is her walking away, knowing the circumstances there was a lot of parallels, but there was a lot of differences. And so that's maybe something that I think I would have liked to have learned as a child also from her, is if things weren't working, how do you walk away and stand up and gain that resilience to move on, in the next chapter of your life?
How did she deal with the separation?
Not so well. I think she struggled. And she never did move on to another partner. She said that she was married for 35 years and she just wanted to focus on herself. But I think in retrospect, now if you would ask her that question, she would say that she wished she had moved on and, found someone else.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes. I personally do think that some people can be just as happy by themselves as other people are with partners. I never want to judge people who decide to stay alone, but it's different from person to person.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you too. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It just depends on the individual. But with her, at the time she left, she said all she wanted to do was just live on her own, because she'd never been on her own, right? She had met my dad when she was 17, but now my mom's 77. Now she will say, when I separated, she said to me, make sure you deal with what you have to do so that you can move on and find someone else. I wish I had done that when I was younger.
Yeah, that's good food for thought.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Roxanne. Do we have more?
No, I think that's it. I think those are the lessons.
Thank you, Roxanne. We learned so much from both you and Mama Carol. I'd like to repeat our lessons that were really, really helpful. First of all, we started with helping people in need, loving your children unconditionally, but then the importance of self-love, to take care of yourself as well in this process, the importance of boundaries. And we got a very practical lesson from you how to start learning about our boundaries and putting up our boundaries. And finally, a lesson you wish you learned from your mom was how to walk away when things were not working and how to deal with it and go on.
Yes. Those are them for sure.
Great. Wow. Great lessons. Roxanne, thank you so much for being my guest. I will post, of course, a link to your website where my listeners can hear more about and read more about you and your work and your book, your podcast, and your other services. Thank you again for being my guest today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was fun, actually, talking about my mom in that frame, because I don't think she is in my book, but I don't know that I've articulated some of the lessons like you made me think about it. So thanks so much for that gift.
You're welcome. Isn't this fun? Almost every single guest says this, and it makes me so happy that through this podcast we are discovering a new way to articulate and think about what we learned from our mothers. I think it's beautiful. It's very inspiring for me.
And I think it's a good legacy piece, because why not do it now if your moms are alive, versus reflecting, unfortunately, when they're not here. I think it'd be a good thing. And I think I probably will play this when my mom, so she can hear what kind of things we shared. So
wonderful. Oh, I'm very happy to hear that. Hi, Mama Carol. Thank you again, Roxanne.
Thank you.
If you have a mama you'd like to share, you could get in touch with me at info@thankyouMama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider. That's ANATAJDER. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.